All right, so now we get to proteins. Proteins are, the word protein comes from the Greek proteus, which means of first importance. That means these guys are super important in your body. Not that the other macromolecules aren't important, but I always think of proteins as the workhorses. They're the ones that do so much work in your body. And as we talk about the different functions of proteins, you'll see how amazing they are and how they are involved in so many different things. Okay, so proteins, what is a protein? It's just a polymer of amino acids. So we're going to be talking about amino acids and the structure of amino acids. But when you put a whole bunch of amino acids together, you get a protein. So a protein is not an amino acid. An amino acid is not a protein. A protein is a polymer. That means many, 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 many amino acids bonded together. All right, so I wrote that here. Proteins are polymers of amino acids. All right, so let's get started with the different functions, because remember, I just told you they're like super important molecules in the body. Let's see what all those important functions are. One of the functions, number one over here, I have enzymes. The majority of catalysts in your body, the ones that speed up reactions, the majority of the enzymes are proteins. There are some enzymes that are made out of nucleic acid, but the majority of them are proteins. So those enzymes we talked about in the last couple of chapters, the amylase, the lactase, the lipase, all of those are protein molecules, okay? So that's number one function. They are enzymes, they speed up reactions, okay? Number two, structure. They are super important in the structure of your muscle and the structure of your connective tissue. The main protein in the body, the most abundant, is collagen, and collagen makes up the main component of connective tissue. If you've had an A&P class, you have heard of the proteins in muscle, actin and myosin and troponin and tropomyosin. Again, all proteins. Okay, so that's second key thing is structure. Transport. There are proteins that will transport things. There's a protein called ferritin that transports iron. Hemoglobin, over here, it transports oxygen. So your red blood cells have the protein hemoglobin, and the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, and then the hemoglobin will transport the oxygen to all the cells of your body. Okay, so that's another function. All right, one more function, movement. Again, back to your A&P classes, anatomy and physiology. You learned that actin and myosin are the main proteins in muscle, and they slide against each other, allowing your muscles to contract, and then you can move. So here you go, movement, another function of proteins. Look how different the functions are. Okay, immune response, function number 5. You've heard of people saying, oh, you have such a good immune system, or oh, you have such a bad immune system, you're always getting sick. Well, this is all about the immunoglobulin proteins that you have. These are the ones that have the antibodies that will fight off a bacteria or a virus or whatever. So the immune response, all those antibodies, those are all proteins. Pretty cool. All right, down here, number 6. Can you see it? Hormones. You've heard of the hormone insulin. When people are diabetic, they are lacking the hormone insulin, or they don't have enough of it. Insulin is a protein. It is a hormone that is released by the beta cells of the pancreas, and then it binds to your muscle cells mainly and allows your glucose to get into the cell. Without that protein, without that hormone that is a protein, our glucose levels would be too high in the bloodstream. So very important protein. It's an example of a hormone. There are other hormones that are proteins. Human growth factor is a protein. Glucagon, which is the hormone that allows the glycogen that's stored in your liver to break down and become glucose in case you forget to eat a meal. Then you got to have that hormone glucagon to tell glycogen to get hydrolyzed and produce glucose in the cell, in the bloodstream. So again, very, very important function. So we're done with hormones. Oh, number 7 is receptors. Remember, I just said that insulin is released by the pancreas, and then insulin has to bind to your muscle cells. Where does it bind? To something called an insulin receptor. So on your cells, on the plasma membrane, there are a whole bunch of different proteins. And those proteins in the plasma membrane, your cell membrane, a lot of them are called receptors because things can bind to them and then either allow your plasma membrane to open up and allow things in, or have a whole bunch of second messenger processes occurring that occur inside the cell. So bottom line is, another function of proteins is they can act as receptors on the membranes to allow hormones or other factors to bind. All right. So I have over here receptors, insulin receptor as an example. All right. And then in the last 3 over here, I don't really have examples, but it's a general thing. Buffers. Proteins in the body can act as buffers. What is a buffer? A buffer is something that prevents pH change. So it doesn't allow something to become too acidic or too basic. A buffer is something that can donate a hydrogen ion or accept a hydrogen ion. So we have buffers. There's one of the amino acids in hemoglobin helps with the buffering. Basically, it's anything that can donate a hydrogen ion and accept a hydrogen ion to maintain the same pH, that's called a buffer. And some proteins are able to do that. Okay? And then gene regulation down here. If you've had a bio class, you've heard of transcription and translation. Well, there are proteins that initiate the whole transcription process. And we're going to be talking about that in the next week's lectures because that's when we get into nucleic acid. So proteins are involved with gene regulation. Another key thing with proteins is that you've all heard of DNA. And again, we're going to talk more about DNA next week. But DNA is very nicely coiled and stored in your nucleus, but what helps coil it and organize it are these proteins called histones, histone proteins. They're around, they package the DNA beautifully. So proteins are involved in the packaging of the DNA and keeping it in your nucleus. So that's another one. And then finally, number 10 here is energy, right? And this is the last thing you want to use your proteins for is for energy. Your body would much rather use carbohydrates and lipids, fats, as their energy source, not your proteins. Proteins are busy doing a lot of other things. The only time your body is going to use protein for energy is if it has to start breaking down your muscle because you have not been eating and you're in starvation mode. Other than that, it rarely uses the protein as energy. And you can get about 4 calories a gram from the protein. Again, we want to use our carbohydrates and lipids. All right. So those are the main functions of proteins. We're going to now get started in talking about the structure of proteins. So proteins, like I said, are polymers of amino acids. And so the term amino acid just means that you have an amine group and an acid group. So an amino acid structurally has an amine group and a carboxylic acid. So I'm going to show you what an amino acid looks like. I'm going to draw the simplest, easiest amino acid. So you recognize this? What is this? This is the carboxylic acid group. Remember that? Okay. Remember this? There's your amine group, the nitrogen. Between the amine group and the carboxylic acid group is a carbon, and we call this the alpha carbon. All right. Now, coming out of this alpha carbon, remember carbon has to have 4 bonds, remember that. So carboxylic acid, amine group, a hydrogen, and then down here, this is the R group. What do I mean by R group? This is what varies between amino acids. So every amino acid is going to look exactly like this, but they differ right here in this R group. And in the next video, we will categorize all the amino acids into the 4 R groups. What are those 4 R groups? They are the nonpolar, and we'll remind you a little bit about what the words polar, nonpolar, and all that is. And then there's the polar neutral. And then there's polar acidic. And then finally there's, I'm going to bring this down, sorry guys. And then there's polar basic. Okay, those are your 4 categories of R groups, or we sometimes call them side chains. So we will start talking about that, and then we'll get into how peptide bonds are formed. What's a peptide bond? That's just a bond between amino acids. So remember how with carbohydrates, when we wanted to create disaccharides and polysaccharides, we had glycosidic bonds. And then with lipids, we had ester bonds to hook up the fatty acids to the glycerol. Well, here we're going to be doing something called peptide bonds. What are the 4 categories that we're going to be putting the amino acids in? These are the 4: nonpolar, polar neutral, polar acidic, and polar basic. Okay, good. So I'll see you in the next video.